The Pacific night was quiet, almost suspiciously quiet. No moon, no wind, only the low hum of turbines and the metallic rhythm of chains sliding across a wet deck. Far out, 40 miles south of Yokosuka, the largest warship Japan had ever built moved through the darkness without escort lights, a shadow of armor and ambition drifting across the open sea. Her name was Shinano, a fortress born from the same bloodline as the Yamato and Musashi. 70,000 tons of hardened steel, armor 7½ inches thick, a flight deck forged like the back of a battleship. To the engineers who designed her, she was the proof that Japan could not be humbled, the empire's redemption after Midway's humiliation. But inside her hull, it did not feel like redemption at all. Welders crouched beside open seams, sparks bursting like fireflies over unfinished joints. Some compartments smelled of primer and hot oil rather than seawater. The bilge pumps groaned unevenly, untested, uncalibrated, while electrical lines hung loose like vines in a steel jungle. Many of the men aboard were not sailors, but shipyard workers still fitting valves, bolting armor, sealing pipes as the ship pushed into the Pacific night. On the bridge, Captain Toshio Abe stood motionless, watching the coastline fade into darkness. His orders were simple: take Shinano to Kure Naval Base for completion. But every officer on the bridge knew the truth. She was not ready for the sea. She had never run a single trial, never tested her watertight doors, never fired her anti-aircraft guns. Yet she sailed anyway, because to delay was to confess weakness. After Midway, weakness had become the unforgivable sin. Pride was now strategy. Every rivet on Shinano's hull, every turn of her turbine, was a declaration that Japan would never bow to American industry, not to the arsenal of democracy with its endless convoys, its Liberty ships, its Essex-class carriers sliding into the water by the week. By 9 in the evening, the ship cleared the breakwater and entered open sea. Her engines drove 20 knots, each vibration shaking dust from bulkheads that had never been sealed. The crew could hear the groan of her frame under strain, but the officers told them it was normal, the voice of a giant waking up. Down in the boiler rooms, young mechanics worked by flashlight, reading gauges with trembling fingers. The air burned past 100 degrees Fahrenheit, the smell of fuel thick enough to taste. Some whispered that Shinano was cursed, that no ship built this fast could carry so much armor and survive. Captain Abe said nothing. He kept his eyes fixed on the black horizon, where nothing moved except the faint white combers rolling toward the ship's bow. Beneath that same horizon, deep under the Pacific, an American submarine had already caught their echo. Above, the flag of the rising sun hung heavy in the damp air, a symbol of pride fluttering over unfinished steel. She was meant to be untouchable, the fortress that would erase Midway's shame. But in truth, every wave that struck her hull carried a question Japan was too proud to answer. The ghosts of Midway still haunted every naval conference room in Tokyo. That defeat in June of 1942, 4 carriers lost in a single day, had not only shattered Japan's striking power, it had humiliated an entire doctrine. The Imperial Navy had believed in speed, precision, and divine favor. America had answered with radar, logistics, and mass production. Now, 2 years later, the Shinano existed as a desperate answer to that loss. She was never part of the original plan. Her keel had once belonged to a battleship, the third of the mighty Yamato-class. But as the war dragged on, Japan needed a miracle more than another set of big guns. So they carved her hull into something new, a hybrid carrier that would carry aircraft, ammunition, and repair equipment all in one. A floating fortress meant to survive what the Akagi and Kaga could not. But even as her hull took shape, the world around Japan was collapsing. In 1943, American industry had reached full fury, an arsenal of democracy roaring 24 hours a day. While Shinano's engineers argued over welding seams, the United States was launching one Liberty ship every 3.5 days, a destroyer escort every week, a B-24 bomber every 63 minutes. America's factories had turned war into arithmetic, and the numbers were merciless. Japan could no longer match speed with scale. Its shipyards worked under blackout, starving for materials, patching damaged cranes, training boys barely out of school. Yet in the Admiralty, no one dared speak of limits. The word delay had become taboo. To question an order was to betray the emperor himself. So the unfinished behemoth was launched, her decks crawling with welders and electricians, her compartments lined with scaffolding. Captain Abe received his sailing orders signed by Vice Admiral Fukudomi himself. Depart Yokosuka immediately. Deliver Shinano to Kure for final armament. Maintain utmost secrecy. There was no time to inspect, no opportunity to test, only the iron weight of duty. The irony was cruel. A warship built to restore honor was already a symbol of fear. Her armor was immense, her engines powerful, but she embodied a deeper truth. Japan's faith in engineering had become faith in illusion. Across the ocean, American production lines rolled like assembly belts of destiny. Steel rails, copper wire, and the bright flash of acetylene torches building ships faster than the sea could sink them. Every rivet on those hulls was an equation, every launch a declaration that the modern world belonged to whoever could outproduce death itself. As Shinano pushed south into open water, that contrast became impossible to ignore. The empire that once worshipped perfection was now forced to gamble with incompletion. The men aboard her did not know it, but their voyage was not just a transfer to Kure. It was a test, not of strength, but of denial. For all her might, Shinano was less a ship than a question. Could pride alone keep her afloat against the mathematics of modern war? By dawn, the illusion of readiness was already cracking. Inside Shinano's vast hull, corridors echoed with the clang of wrenches and the hiss of welding torches. Sparks rained across steel decks still warm from the yard. The ship smelled not of salt and paint, but of molten flux and cutting oil. The scent of something unfinished forced into battle dress. On paper, she was magnificent. Her pumps could move thousands of gallons per minute. Her generators produced more electricity than a small town, and her watertight doors were rated to withstand near-perfect pressure. But the paper was a lie. None of it had been tested. Gaskets hung loose from their fittings. The auxiliary pumps had been sealed, but never run under load. The engine telegraph still bore chalk markings from the Yokosuka dockyard. Chief Engineer Nakamura knew what that meant. When he reported that some compartments were leaking from faulty welds, his superior only shrugged. Orders from above had forbidden further delay. "She's armored," the officer said flatly. "She's Shinano. She will not need them." It was a statement born not of confidence but of desperation. Japan's engineers had built marvels before. The silent torpedoes of Pearl Harbor, the Zero fighter, the Yamato's 18-inch guns, and they still believed in the divinity of design. But Shinano was different. She was built in secret, hurried through the slips under constant bombing threat, finished by men who worked nights under blackout lamps. Many of them had never built a carrier before. They were improvising on a monument. The result was a paradox in steel, a warship whose strength made her weak. Her armor was so thick it forced structural compromises. Bulkheads designed for a battleship had been cut and re-welded to fit aircraft elevators. Every change weakened another seam. She was not a ship designed for efficiency. She was an apology carved into metal, a symbol ordered into existence because Japan could not afford to look small. Captain Abe understood that truth more than he admitted. On the bridge, he studied the crew reports, misaligned hatches, leaky valves, sluggish bilge pressure. He could feel the vibration of the unbalanced turbines beneath his feet. But the order was clear. Proceed to Kure. Finish the work there. No discussion. Even the men below decks felt the tension. They whispered about the fortune of the Musashi, sunk only weeks before in the Philippine Sea. The sailors called it Yamato's shadow. And now Shinano was its ghost. Same blood, same arrogance, same fate waiting beneath the horizon. One mechanic muttered that the ship was too heavy for her own salvation. The remark earned him a slap from a petty officer, but the words lingered in the humid air. Too heavy for salvation. By afternoon, the welders packed up their gear, leaving behind streaks of slag along the passageways. The ship finally looked finished. But it was only a performance. She was still bleeding air from the seams. The sea was calm, deceptively kind. The horizon stretched empty and blue, as if daring the empire to believe its own propaganda. And it did. The officer signed off each checklist with ceremonial precision, pretending completion meant safety. But in the quiet below decks, Nakamura knew better. He could hear the faint hiss of seawater seeping through an unfinished joint, a whisper that no one wanted to acknowledge. They called her invincible. They called her the Empire's fortress, yet every sound she made told another story, one of haste, denial, and the arithmetic of doom waiting just beyond the next wave. Far below the waves, an American submarine prowled the darkness. Her name was USS Archerfish, and her commander, Lieutenant Commander Joseph Enright, was a man trying to redeem his own career. Months earlier, he had failed to sink a target, hesitated when it mattered. Now, as his sonar men listened through static, he had sworn not to hesitate again. It was 8 o'clock in the evening when the radar operator called out, "Large contact, we're at bearing 090. The reading was massive, far larger than any merchant ship. Enright ordered his crew to battle stations. The submarine dove, running silent, every man gripping a handle or pipe as they slid deeper beneath the Pacific. The sonar pings grew stronger, slower. The sound of something enormous moving fast. Through the periscope, Enright saw only a faint silhouette, a dark ridge against darker water. No escorts, no running lights. Whatever it was, it moved like a ship that thought itself untouchable. He trailed the target for 6 hours, adjusting depth, plotting intercepts, letting the enemy make the first mistake. Above, Shinano's crew saw nothing. They steamed south at 20 knots, trusting their armor in the dark. The sea was calm enough to make a man forget the war entirely. Some sailors leaned on the rails, looking up at the scattered stars reflected in the black surface. It was peaceful, too peaceful. At 3 in the morning, fate turned by a fraction of a degree. Captain Abe ordered a slight course change, just enough to expose the ship's starboard flank. Below, Enright's fire control officer whispered, "Range closing. 3,000 yards. Enright waited. He could almost feel the vibration of those massive engines through the hull of his submarine. Then he gave the order. Fire 1, fire 2, fire 3, fire 4, fire 5, fire 6. 6 torpedoes streaked into the dark, their wakes dissolving into the silence. 40 seconds later, the ocean erupted. The first hit slammed beneath the forward elevator, ripping open a seam below the armored belt. The second struck near the boiler rooms where welders had left incomplete joints. The third and fourth tore through compartments that had never been pressure tested. Deep inside the ship, sailors were thrown against bulkheads as compartments collapsed inward. In the control room, Nakamura heard the first explosion and froze. A wall of steam burst from a ruptured pipe, filling the passage with boiling mist. Lights flickered red, then black. The great ship shuddered as though struck by a hammer from below. Water began flooding faster than the pumps could manage. Up on the bridge, Captain Abe gripped the railing as the deck vibrated beneath his boots. He demanded reports, damage estimates, flooding rates, casualty counts. But the radios crackled with static. Every voice below came through broken, frantic. For a moment, Abe stood silent, staring out into the night. He had believed this ship could survive a dozen torpedoes. Only 4 had hit, yet already the fortress was bleeding. Below, sailors ran through knee-deep water, trying to close watertight doors that refused to seal. Hissing steam, shouting men, the clang of steel against steel. It sounded like the inside of a dying machine. The lights pulsed, then steadied to a dim red glow. Far away, Enright's crew listened through their sonar headsets. 4 clean detonations. The operator muttered, almost reverently, "We hit her good, skipper. She's hurting." In the submarine silence, Enright didn't smile. He knew what they had just done, and what it meant. Above them, 70,000 tons of steel were groaning, twisting, filling with water. The ocean was still again, but different now. The calm had turned predatory. Shinano's heartbeat slowed, each thud of her engines echoing through the deep like the pulse of a wounded giant. And in that black water between predator and prey, 2 nations met, one armed with belief, the other with mathematics. The first explosions had torn open 4 wounds in Shinano's starboard side, but the greater damage came from the orders that followed. Captain Abe believed what his engineers had promised, that the ship could take 12 torpedo hits without sinking. He refused to slow down. Instead, he barked a command that sealed her fate. Full speed ahead! The turbines roared to life, driving 70,000 tons of unfinished armor against the Pacific's resistance. Every additional knot increased the pressure on her fractured bulkheads. The water that had already begun seeping through the seams was now being rammed deeper into the ship by sheer velocity. It was the mathematics of self-destruction. Speed multiplied by pressure equaled collapse. In the lower decks, Chief Engineer Nakamura was fighting a losing war. Steam and salt water filled the compartments, turning metal stairs into waterfalls. The auxiliary pumps screamed under overload until their belts snapped. Electric motors shorted out with a blinding flash, the stench of ozone mixing with diesel fumes. Men used mattresses, canvas, even their bare hands to plug ruptures in the bulkheads. For every gallon they pumped out, 10 more surged in. Boiler Room 2 lost power first. The lights went black, replaced by the sickly red of emergency bulbs. The temperature climbed past 120 degrees Fahrenheit. Men slipped on oil and fell into water that boiled against the hot deck plates. Some tried to climb, others prayed. One screamed for his mother. The kind of sound a steel ship never forgets. On the bridge, Abe demanded reports, his voice rising above the chaos of alarms. "Stabilize the flooding. Keep the list under 10 degrees." But below there was no control left to keep. The crew in the midsection shouted that the watertight doors would not close. Many of the rubber seals had been installed only hours before departure. When the ship heeled to starboard, the doors jammed against their frames. Water found its way through electrical conduits, through hatches, through every shortcut taken in Yokosuka's rush to please the Admiralty. Shinano was armored like a mountain and built like a sieve. By 4 in the morning, she listed 10 degrees. By 5, 15. Pumps failed one by one as seawater shorted the circuits. The main generators went offline, plunging the ship into darkness. The sound that replaced them was ancient, the dull roar of the sea reclaiming its own. Men in the compartments aft tried to reach the passageways leading upward, but the stairwells were already underwater. Those who could not swim clung to the bulkheads, whispering the imperial anthem under their breath. Others continued to work, hammering bolts into the panels, wrapping hoses around leaking pipes, refusing to accept that the ocean does not negotiate. Above, the officers still believed that power and will could save them. Pride was their compass now. They had forgotten that a ship's greatest enemy is not the one firing torpedoes, but the silence that follows when every calculation fails. In the calm space between explosions, Shinano's heartbeat weakened. The turbines still turned, but the hull around them had begun to buckle. The vibration changed pitch, a slow, groaning moan that carried through every deck. Some said it sounded like the ship herself crying, and in that moment even the sea seemed to pause, as if waiting to see whether arrogance could outlast physics. By dawn, the great ship was dying. The horizon glowed pale gray, and every man aboard could feel it, the slow, uneven roll that told them the list had grown worse. The gauges in the damage control station read hopeless numbers. 10 degrees, 15, 25. Each tilt sent new waves of seawater surging through the lower decks, smashing open bulkheads that had held for only a few hours. At 7 o'clock, the list reached 25 degrees. The portside passageways were half flooded, the floors slick with oil and debris. Sailors stumbled through the corridors carrying tools and ropes, shouting for missing men. Others were trapped behind jammed steel doors that had warped under pressure. The ship's pumps had stopped completely. Their electric motors hissed, sparked, and went silent. Up on the bridge, Captain Abe stared at the inclinometer, the brass needle crawling toward 30 degrees. His face was calm, but his hands trembled behind his back. The reports were fragments now. Engine room 2 gone. Boiler flooded. Steering jammed. Somewhere below, an explosion echoed as compressed air tanks ruptured. At 9 o'clock, Abe gave the order to call for assistance. 3 destroyers, Isokaze, Hamakaze, and Yukikaze, raced toward the crippled carrier, their wakes cutting white scars across the black water. They managed to pass tow cables, each as thick as a man's arm. When the winches took strain, the cables snapped with a sound like cannon fire. One recoiled across the deck and struck a sailor square in the chest, killing him instantly. Still, the captain refused to abandon ship. He ordered all available men to shift weight to port and continue sealing compartments. The order made no sense, but no one dared question it. Discipline was sacred, obedience stronger than survival. The crew sang softly while they worked, voices muffled by the hiss of flooding air. By 10 o'clock, the Shinano was listing 30 degrees. The ocean was pouring down ventilation shafts and elevator wells. Planes lashed to the hangar deck, broke free, and slid into the water. Lifeboats hung sideways against their davits, useless. The ship's massive rudder jammed in its housing, grinding like bone against bone. Inside the flooded compartments, men clung to pipes and ladders, choking on diesel fumes and salt. They could hear the metallic thunder of the sea battering against the hull, a rhythm too strong to fight. Some closed their eyes and waited for the sound to stop. At 10:18, Captain Abe finally gave the order. Abandon ship. It was too late. The decks were at 40 degrees, impossible to stand on. Those who tried to climb found themselves sliding toward the rails into the cold, gray water below. The destroyers nearby launched boats, but the currents around the giant hull spun them like toys. Abe remained on the bridge. The officers begged him to come down, but he only adjusted his cap, straightened his coat, and looked toward the rising sun. "A captain's duty ends where his ship does," he said quietly. At 10:57, Shinano rolled completely onto her starboard side. The sea swallowed her with a roar that echoed for miles, a mountain of steel vanishing beneath its own weight. The survivors watched from the waves as bubbles and oil boiled to the surface. For a moment, the ocean seemed to breathe. Then it went still again, as if nothing had ever been there. 70,000 tons of pride had disappeared into silence, and with her went the last illusion that Japan's armor could resist the arithmetic of the modern world. The sea that morning was calm again, eerily calm, as if exhausted by what it had done. All that remained of Shinano was a slick of oil stretching for miles, a thin black mirror broken by fragments of wood, floating helmets, and the slow drift of bodies in white undershirts. From a distance it looked peaceful, almost ceremonial, until one realized those shapes were men who had believed their ship unsinkable. Out of the 2,515 souls who had sailed from Yokosuka, more than 1,435 were gone. Many never reached the surface at all. Some were trapped in compartments that sealed like coffins, pounding on steel walls until the sound stopped. Others drowned in the open, weighed down by waterlogged uniforms, whispering the emperor's name as the ocean closed over them. The destroyers Isokaze, Hamakaze, and Yukikaze circled the site for hours, rescuing who they could. Their orders were brutal in their simplicity. Save only those who remained calm. Panic was considered shameful. Men screaming for help were left to drift away. One petty officer later wrote that he could still hear the voices calling across the water long after the sound of engines had faded. Captain Toshio Abe kept his final promise. Witnesses on the destroyers said they saw him standing on the bridge as the ship rolled. He did not attempt to swim, did not reach for a rope. He simply disappeared beneath the waves along with the rising sun on his sleeve. For the Imperial Navy, it was the death of a tradition older than the war itself, a commander choosing honor over breath. When word reached Tokyo, the Admiralty reacted not with mourning, but with silence. The loss was classified top secret. There would be no headlines, no radio broadcast, no mention of Shinano's name in the newspapers. The men who survived were confined to barracks and sworn to secrecy under threat of imprisonment. Officially, the carrier had never existed. Yet across the ocean in Pearl Harbor, Lieutenant Commander Joseph Enright filed his patrol report. 4 confirmed hits. A heavy explosion. Target believed destroyed. Even the Americans doubted it at first. The ship described was too large, too improbable. Only after the surrender did naval intelligence confirm the truth. Archerfish had sunk the largest warship ever lost to a submarine. Enright received the Navy Cross. His crew earned the Presidential Unit Citation. Their victory became a footnote in history, but to the Japanese it was an unspoken wound. A fortress that should have been a symbol of invincibility had drowned without ever firing a shot. In the months that followed, whispers spread among sailors and shipyard workers. Some said Shinano had carried a curse, that she had been born from the bones of the Yamato's unfinished sister and inherited its doom. Others said it was not a curse at all, only the natural end of a nation that had mistaken faith for preparation. Whatever the truth, the silence around her loss spoke louder than any eulogy. The empire had built the strongest hull in history and filled it with fear, denial, and superstition. Pride had been their armor, but pride also sank faster than steel. That morning, as the oil slick drifted east toward the rising sun, the survivors clung to wreckage and watched the sky brighten. Some wept, some prayed, and some simply stared at the horizon, where nothing remained of their ship but a thin shimmer of light across the water, a reflection of everything their country had believed was unsinkable. For weeks afterward, the sea gave back pieces of her. Planks of decking washed ashore near Shionomisaki, charred tools from the machine shops, fragments of lifeboats marked with black stenciled letters, Shinano. Fishermen found them drifting like ghosts of iron and paint, reminders of a secret the Navy refused to name. It was not until after Japan's surrender that the world learned what had happened, that a carrier, larger than any built by the United States, armored beyond reason, had vanished on her maiden voyage. When American investigators pieced together the reports, they were astonished not by the submarine's accuracy, but by the sheer negligence that had made the kill possible. Shinano had never completed her pressure tests, never calibrated her pumps, never sealed her own armor. The weapon that doomed her had been mathematics, the simple equation of weight, water, and human pride. Historians would later call it the last stand of Japan's industrial faith. A ship built to prove superiority instead revealed the limits of belief. The empire that had once prided itself on perfection had gambled everything on an illusion. Her fall marked more than the loss of 70,000 tons of steel. It was the collapse of a national idea, that spirit could replace logistics, that discipline could overcome arithmetic, that courage alone could float a ship. In the decades that followed, divers would locate the wreck, 4,000 meters down, resting upright in darkness off the coast of Honshu. The hull was split open along the same seams the engineers had warned about. The flight deck, still mostly intact, lay tilted like a tombstone. Around it, the ocean had grown quiet, the current slow and reverent. Shinano had become a museum without visitors, her compartment sealed forever by pressure and time. Even now, sonar images reveal her shadow on the seabed, a gray outline of ambition turned elegy. The once mighty ship remains too deep to raise, too vast to forget. She endures as both a monument and a warning, because Shinano was never truly defeated by torpedoes. She was defeated by unfinished steel, by orders that ignored physics, by men who mistook obedience for wisdom. Her destruction was not a single moment of impact, but a chain of decisions, each forged in pride, each impossible to take back once the sea began to rise. Strength without integrity is weakness multiplied. The engineers who designed her had meant to build a fortress. Instead, they built a mirror, and in that reflection, Japan saw its own exhaustion. Above the Pacific, the waves still close and open as they always have. Indifferent, endless. The oil long since dispersed, the wreck long since swallowed. But somewhere beneath that surface, the ship still waits. Silent proof that no armor, no doctrine, no empire can survive the weight of its own denial. Every rivet, every weld, every heartbeat beneath that flag was part of a single lesson written in steel. And if you believe that courage still means facing truth, not hiding from it, then remember her. Remember the ship that was never meant to die, and the men who believed she couldn't.